All right, lastly, let's talk a little bit about the economics of organ donations. This is kind of an interesting little case study. So organs that are available for transplant are very scarce. So many times people need an organ transplant. It's hard to get them. Organs are they have to, a very specific set of clinical things has to happen in order for an organ to be eligible to be donated. And also the window is quite small. With, between the time that someone who dies and wants to donate an organ, between the time of their death and the time that it would have to be inserted into another human body, it's a relatively short one, which means that the supply is sort of always low. And so this transplant wait list, the fact that you can't get an organ right away, imposes a big cost on dying patients. And in other contexts, we would say that, well, anytime we see wait lists, whether it's for organ donations or for your favorite restaurant, it would suggest that the market is maybe not doing a great job of matching the supply to the demand. One other oddity of this organ market is, unlike many things in developed countries, even the wealthiest people can't get one. And so it raises this question, like, is this apparent dysfunction of the market for organs creating a social loss like we've seen in some of the previous slides? Or is this waiting list actually a socially efficient outcome? Kind of a curious question. So here are a couple ways to think about it. The concept of repugnant transactions is an interesting one. Some people will argue that organ sales, so you're paying someone to, having a set price for a kidney or a liver or whatever, some people would argue that such organ sales or to commoditize the human body is immoral and degrading for the society that would permit that. That is the view held by almost every country on Earth, by almost every society on Earth, that it would be in some ways ethically wrong to parse out the human body and sell it for parts. That's the prevailing, seems to be the prevailing approach to organ donation and organ sales. So not just the principle of that, but also that the allocation of these organs could easily violate notions of equity, which also seem to be important to people's consideration of an ethical society, namely that you could be super rich and you can live, and then if you are not wealthy, you could be in a position where you're more or less forced to sell a kidney in order to get by, and so those are also transactions or features of an economic market that would be disadvantageous and could create negative feelings. So this collection of and distribution of organs could make people feel that this unregulated sale of organs is repugnant or is some sort of a social evil, and as a result, this feeling that living in a society that has commoditized the human body creates a social loss. It's a negative externality. If you were to live in a society where people could be chopped up for parts, that would be a negative externality in itself. And so people who are not even party to this organ sale suffer because they know that this is happening somewhere in their community. So the Pigovian approach, when I say Pigot, you should always think either tax or subsidy. And so the Pigovian approach would be an infinite tax, is one way to think about it. So you would say that the Pigovian approach is you apply a tax to that transaction that's so enormous that it is infinite, and so that is how you correct this externality so that we don't have this repugnance problem. So if repugnance is relatively low, if people don't really mind, then the tax could be small and would not it would not deter very many organ transactions. But if people really object to it, which seems to be true of most societies, but every society that I know of, then the optimal Pigovian tax could be quite high to discourage most organ sales. And if it's so extreme, then if the repugnance is very extreme, then the optimal Pigovian tax could be infinite, so that no one at all would sell any organs. So this is functionally equivalent, that would be economically equivalent to a ban on organ sales, which is what most developed countries have done. That's the preferred policy. There is a ban on organ sales in essentially every country. And banning the monetary organ transactions accounts for most of the idiosyncrasies of this market, especially the long waiting times for organs. It affects the supply, obviously, and when there's a constrained supply, then sometimes there are wait times. But that still might be the preferred outcome, even in the presence of waiting lists. It can still be the correct outcome if the repugnance associated with those transactions is sufficiently high. And so you could still have an economically efficient organ donation system that has waitlists. That is, the presence of waitlists themselves does not necessarily mean that the market is off. And in this case, it probably is not. That said, it's still excellent if you can find ways to shorten the waiting lists. You could create subsidies that provide people financial incentives for people to become organ donors. So that might be one way to encourage people to sign up for organ donation lists, and that could help to increase the supply and decrease the wait time, which would be great. And also, as we download app after app on our phones, we know that about the power of the default setting. So if your privacy settings on your social media apps are set to very liberal and everybody can see everything that you do, if that's the default setting, you'll probably be more likely to share content. And if the default setting were to share nothing, then you would probably share less content. So some people have suggested that there should be a default opt-in to donating organs. In other words, if you are automatically on the list to donate your organs, and that you would have to manually select opt out if you didn't want to donate your organs. That being said, there's actually some pretty mixed evidence on this. I do not consider this an area of specialization for me, but I just took a look at a couple of articles in literature, and it sounds like this actually didn't make as much of a difference as you might expect, just because of the oddities of this market and where organs have to come from. It has to come from like you can't do a liver transplant with someone who has a bad liver. So if someone dies and they want to donate their organs, then they have to have done so in a way that doesn't damage their systems, and they can't be contagious in any way. They cannot have had cancer, and so a lot of people who die in hospitals have other comorbid conditions that make them not really eligible to be organ donors. And so there were some other attempts to change this, though. So there were maybe a better strategy is actually to change practices in intensive care. So Spain had this they organized a national board for organ donation in 1989, and that national organization, I think it was sort of a government appendage, probably a nonprofit of some sort, and so they came up with a whole national program for how to increase organ donations. And one of the things that they did was to stick a donor coordinator in every single hospital. And so then that donor coordinator would go around to patients who are in intensive care and to just talk with them about end-of-life care and about what their preferences for donating their organs, and to explain that other people may need it, there's a waiting list, et cetera. And that did seem to have some effect. It seemed to be a pretty on the ground pragmatic way to get people to donate their organs, and I think that seems like a great thing to do. So wrapping up a couple of things. So when externalities create a social loss, we've seen several examples of that now. A government action like a Pigovian tax can improve social welfare, or Pigovian subsidy in the case of social benefits. But not every externality necessarily justifies action. It's probably worth thinking about, is every externality valid? Or are there some externalities that are so extraneous or frivolous or idiosyncratic that they can be discounted in the social welfare function? Some people might have really particular preferences. I was just reading about Boston city housing, and so there are some regulations about having enough parking permits. The new developments often have to have a certain amount of parking, and that's a preference that some people have, is to make sure that there are that there's enough parking and that people have a car, and so they want to be able to always park their car, and so any new developments should have that. But one of the negative externalities associated with that is it shrinks the housing supply. And all of us pay for that in the form of higher cost of property, whether that's rent or ownership. So it's not clear that that is, that preference should be weighted so heavily. It could be that maybe car owners' preferences count for something, but there might be other ways to solve that by, for example, they could get a space in a garage, and if they wanted to, rather than have it be a mandatory thing. So that's the creation, the regulation to have a lot of parking spaces available for new developments does create a negative externality. But exactly whose preferences should matter in this context, and how important, like how seriously should we take the car owner complaints? I think that's a matter probably for public debate. And of course, it's not just a philosophical exercise. Like we just saw in the case of organs, it has deciding how to treat organ sales and how we think about repugnance and people's negative externalities that they experience from that. Recognizing the validity of that externality profoundly shapes what this market looks like, and what the waiting lists look like. So to summarize here, externalities occur when prices do not account for some harm or some benefit created by an activity, usually a transaction in economics. Externalities are one method by which markets fail to self-regulate. Market failure, as we know, is economically inefficient. We could be better off. So if we can fix it, we should. Markets do not exist outside of society and social relations. Karl Polanyi wrote a book called The Great Transformation, in which he articulates this concept. And markets can't exist outside of societies that help to prop them up. They are tools. Markets are tools to achieve social benefits. And sometimes markets fail to achieve the benefits that we expect from them. Externalities are a really good example of this. And in healthcare, these are particularly true. So when markets flounder and they don't reach these social optimal levels that we hope they do, with equilibrium prices and maximize consumer surplus and maximize producer surplus, and instead we wind up with some botched version of that where we're falling far short, or we're going much too far past the social equilibrium, sometimes there are ways that you can fix this. And in the cases when markets don't deliver the things that we've asked them to deliver, we can either repair them or replace them as needed. We've talked about a number of different ways to do that in this lecture. There are several tools available to policymakers. That includes taxes and subsidies. Sometimes regulation is the right choice. Sometimes an accessible legal system is the right choice. Thanks for listening.